I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Russian troops continue to advance in Kupyansk, bringing the fighting inside the city, Ukraine strikes an oil refinery and an oil processing complex, more than 800 miles inside Russia. We discuss how NATO could implement a no-fly zone in Ukraine and zoom in on Russian frozen assets and how they could be used to support Ukraine. Finally, we hear from Anastasia Dovbnia of Save Ukraine about the latest news on their efforts to bring children back from Russia and the occupied territories.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 18th of September, 3 years and 208 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by Chief Foreign Analyst Roland Oliphant and chemical weapons expert and former tank commander Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. First, let's go to the military updates with Roland.
So Ukraine's military said this morning it struck an oil refinery in Russia's Volgograd region overnight. Ukrainian special forces said the Volgograd oil refinery had halted operations, citing preliminary information. Two Ukrainian drones also struck the Gazprom Neftekhim Salavat oil processing and petrochemical complex, which is one of Russia's largest, in Bashkortostan, which is quite a way deeper into Russia. That's over near the Ural Mountains and the Kazakh border, about 870 miles from the front line. This has been confirmed by both Russian and Ukrainian sources. The regional governor said on social media 2 drones attacked the facility. There were no fatalities or people wounded. Passive and active defences were activated. That means the site security opened fire to neutralise them. We are assessing the state of the damage and currently extinguishing the fire. That same complex was attacked by Ukraine in May 2024, apparently, so not the first time. There. The Ukrainian Air Force, for its part, says it shot down 48 out of 75 drones launched by Russia overnight and reported 26 drone hits at 6 locations around the country. Seem to be concentrated in Poltava and railway infrastructure in that region's Mirhorod district. An attack wounded 1 person and caused fires, according to regional governor Volodymyr Kohut. And the Ukrainian state railways said the attack temporarily cut power to several stations, prompted delays for about 3 hours of passenger trains, and another evening attack on Poltava region damaged a fuel station, caused a fire and wounded 4 more people, according to the emergency services, and thus not the heaviest drone strike we've seen in recent times. I'm going to turn now to the front line, the ground war, the conventional war, on the battlefield, starting 12 o'clock position in the kind of Sumy and Kursk Oblast. If you wish to get your map out, Russian troops attacked, this is going on reports from the Center for Defense Strategies from last night, so in the previous 24 hours. Russian troops attacked near Kondrativka, Andriivka, Alexeyevka, Varichnia, and went on the defensive in Yunakivka. A Russian military blogger reported or claimed that Ukrainian forces have effectively encircled Russian forces in the village of Alexeyevka. That's confirmed by Ukrainian forces. CDS says the Ukrainian forces counterattacked and are completing the encirclement of the enemy in Alexeyevka, and predicts that the Russian 30th Motorized Rifle Regiment of the 72nd Motorized Rifle Division will soon leave its positions in the village. Moving around Kharkiv region, north of Kharkiv city, Russian forces continued offensive operations around Veliki Burlak. No confirmed advances there. Unconfirmed reports of Russian advances near Vovchansk. Over towards Kupyansk. I've been away and not looking at the map for a while, but I did notice today in the updates the fighting is now inside Kupyansk in the very northern edges or outskirts of the city. So the Russian incremental advance has finally made it inside the town, apparently, which may not be news today. It was news to me. According to CDS, Russian forces advanced along Sadova Street in Kupyansk, put in attacks in several other villages in the area, moving further down towards the Liman and Siversk directions, as the Ukrainians want to call them. There's a report from CDS that the Russians are really putting in a renewed effort against Liman and Siversk. Interestingly, the Ukrainians are also claiming that Russian troops in civilian clothes, hence in violation of the Geneva Convention, are operating in Yampil, which is a town in that area that's held by Ukraine's 11th Armoured Corps. The Centre for Defence Strategy says Russians are trying to squeeze Siversk salient, which was or probably remains the easternmost part of Ukrainian-controlled territory on the front, from 3 sides on that salient. And they've also stepped up efforts towards Liman. Interestingly, they say that particularly towards Liman, they've concentrated so many of their forces there that actually it's going to give Ukraine's Third Army Corps quite a little bit of latitude to counterattack on the sections of the line there that have been weakened for the push along here. Konstantinivka, the defense of the fortress belt. Russian troops in the 24 hours up to Tuesday evening were reported to have advanced on the very southeastern outskirts of Konstantinivka and also along the T0504, that's the Bakhmut to Konstantinivka highway, which comes straight into town directly from the east, basically. So the Russians continuing to push to Konstantinivka as they have been for a while. We have an assessment that says Russia is likely to try to cut the H20 highway. That's the highway that links the fortress belt, the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, down to Konstantinivka agglomeration, likely by attacking towards Druzhkivka, which is the next town up the road. So that a likely next Russian step in their attempt to break into and slowly begin to degrade that really strategically important fortress belt. Dobropilya, that small town north of Pokrovsk, where the Russians put in that surprising breakthrough several weeks ago that then went wrong. Ukraine retains the initiative there. 3rd week in a row, Russia has been losing territory there. Apparently, Russian Marines who previously deployed in Sumy have been rushed in there. It doesn't look likely they're going to be able to turn around that situation, however. And then Pokrovsk itself, still the very, very central Russian effort. Everything the Russians can get concentrated, their operational reserves, whatever troops they've got available. They're attacking into Myrnograd, which is the little town next door to Pokrovsk, on the eastern flank with armoured vehicles. And we've got different kind of assessments of just how deep they've got into Pokrovsk itself. But if they're not inside the southwestern portion of the city, they're getting close. Now, Novopavlivka, which is further... This is where things get, I think, a little bit interesting. Kind of southwest of Pokrovsk, right? Kind of on that bend in the line where it goes into the kind of line that cuts across towards across Zaporizhzhia Oblast into the river. A while ago, we were told that was a really problematic point for the Ukrainians, that they were weak, that the Russians had managed to, make quite a bit of progress, and it looked like they could achieve a breakthrough. It seems like they haven't. So the 41st Combined Arms Army's 90th Tank Division was apparently the unit that was given the task of breaking through Novopavlivka. Apparently hasn't been able to do so. Centre for Defence Strategy says that's partly because Ukrainian forces managed to kind of contain and direct Russian troops into the area between 2 rivers, limiting its ability to manoeuvre, and the Ukrainians have been putting in quite a lot of counterattacks there. The Russians are responding by trying to kind of stretch the line a bit by both to the north and to the south. And that's a trend that they've been seeing for some time. If they achieve a breakthrough there, of course, it would threaten not only kind of Pokrovsk, but also that whole line through Huliopolya towards Orikhiv, towards the Dnipro River. And on that direction around Orikhiv, we have seen incremental Russian advances along that line in the past couple of days. The Institute for the Study of War says they've got geolocated footage talking about a very small gain by the Russians in the past 24 hours, right on that bank of the river over near Kupyansk. So overall, incremental Russian advances up and down the line, much as we've seen for the past month or year or more. That's more or less the military overview. Adélie.
And next up, we're going to go to Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, who's joining us today. I'll do the political and diplomatic updates a bit later, as Hamish hasn't got a lot of time with us today. Hamish, hello, it's good to have you back.
Yeah, hi, Adélie. Thanks very much for having me back, and great to see Roland at DSCI, the defence show, last week.
You published a piece in the Telegraph last week arguing in favour of a NATO no-fly zone. So let's start and speak about that. The NATO no-fly zone would be over Western Ukraine in order to prevent future civilian bombings. So can you just recap for us what that would look like in practice, but also why it's not been done earlier in the war?
Yeah, certainly. And this is something that is very close to my heart indeed. If I just step back a little bit, I was in Iraq in 1991, the first Gulf War, when we set up a no-fly zone in the north of Iraq, which prevented Saddam Hussein's air force attacking the Kurdish race. And Saddam Hussein tried to exterminate the Kurds and would have done without this no-fly zone. And the Kurds, thank heavens, survived and lived on. So to me, that was a very compelling reason. I actually saw it practically on the ground and how it worked. And then my sort of 10 years in Syria, I campaigned at the early stage of the Syrian conflict in 2013, when I'd been into Syria to look for and try and find evidence of President Assad using chemical weapons. And I saw a lot of the Syrian air attacks, which were predominantly against civilian targets. And then in 2015, 2016, the Russians joined in as well. And I stamped the boards of the House of Commons, the Houses of Parliament, trying to brief politicians and get them to understand actually how important it was, with the Syrian and the Russians just attacking civilian targets. The least I thought NATO could do was to try and stop them, and they had the capability. Now, we didn't do anything. And I was back in Syria a few months ago, and we discussed that on the pod a few months ago. But a couple of 100,000 civilians were probably killed by those airstrikes. So that is why it has been so compelling. But I think a lot of people are slightly confused and have got the wrong end of the stick here, and are thinking that if NATO jets, British jets or whatever, did take down Russian drones and missiles, that in effect would create some sort of conflict with Russia. And Dmitry Medvedev, the old prime minister and now some minor official in the Kremlin, who spouts vitriol virtually every day, has said this would create war with Russia. Well, we are not talking about RAF jets fighting and knocking down Russian jets. The most practical reason that won't happen is actually the Russian Air Force has pretty much failed to soldier, failed to fly for some time now, and we rarely see Russian jets in Ukraine airspace. What we are seeing a heck of a lot of, which you're reporting daily, is missiles and drones, predominantly at civilian targets. Although Dmitry Medvedev and the spokesman Peskov always say they're military targets, I can't see how schools and hospitals are military targets. So, in effect, what me and others have been calling for is a no-fly zone, if you like, for drones and missiles. Now, in practical terms, and Adélie, you mentioned sort of Western Ukraine, that's because practically, without getting NATO aircraft into Ukraine airspace, about as far as they can interdict these missiles and drones is probably about 200 kilometers. But that would protect a whole raft of Ukraine civilian populations. Now, the other thing I think to consider that people are worried about is that we might see NATO jets being shot down by Russian air defense. Well, I think it's been proved fairly comprehensively. I'm no great expert on air power, but I have spoken to people who are, and the key Russian air defense, the S-400s, we saw that when the Americans struck the nuclear program in Iran a few months ago, or quite a few months ago, those F-35s and stealth jets were unaffected by Russian air defense, the S-300s, S-400s, and by Russian fighter jets. So again, using expertise of others who know about these things, it is felt that NATO F-35s, and there are a lot of them in Europe, could carry out this task without being interdicted. And I think the final thing on the no-fly zone here, Adélie, is I know that you guys have already discussed the Zapad exercises happening in Belarus at the moment, 100,000 or so Belarusian and Russian troops exercising. I mean, the observation as an ex-army officer I'd say on this is they don't appear to be learning the lessons that perhaps they should have been learning in Ukraine in the exercises that they're doing. But that's another thing. But let's not forget, it was exactly these exercises in January, February 2022, which preceded the invasion into Ukraine on the 24th of February 2024. So really, in sum, I feel that actually the key thing that NATO could achieve is to protect civilian targets in the west of Ukraine. And with Putin showing absolutely no inclination at all to come to the peace negotiation table, then maybe this might be a catalyst to do it, quite apart from the fact that I think it will save hundreds, if not thousands, of Ukrainian civilian lives until a peace or ceasefire deal is done.
Thank you, Hamish. So you may not be an expert on the air war, but you are an expert on chemical weapons. And I want to turn to a report from the Ukrainian Armed Forces that was published a couple of days ago. And that says that there were 11,000 documented cases of chemical weapons used by Russia since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And that affected 3,000 troops so far. So what are your insights on this report?
Well, yeah, I think this is really important. And actually, at DSCI in Excel in London last week, I met up with, let's call him Colonel X, who is an ex-American military officer who has been serving with the Ukraine army for some time. And he was back from the front line. He operates in the Donbass. Again, I won't mention the brigades or anything like that. But he has been my sort of eyes and ears, and he is not a chemical weapons expert as such, but certainly he has been at the forefront of this battle, and the brigades that he helps and advises have been the ones who've absolutely been at the forefront. And listening to him confirm quite what a devastating effect these chemical attacks had, although, and again, I won't go over ground that we've covered already, but 11,000 uses is phenomenally large. Mainly something called chloropicrin, which was one of the first chemical weapons used in the First World War. It's a choking agent. It doesn't necessarily kill people, but the actions of those people who are suffering from chloropicrin quite often leads to their death because they have to get out of trenches into fresh air, where again the Russians follow them up. So it was interesting to hear from him from first hand, and actually, hopefully moving forward, things will improve, because something else that we learnt last week and beyond is that the British government have actually organised well over 100,000 British and American respirators, gas masks, to go to the front line, and they are now starting to trickle in. So actually, those 11,000, if the Russians continue to use it, which we know that they're using virtually anything they can to try and get an advantage, actually now the majority, or certainly a lot of the guys in the front line, will now have these gas mask respirators or will get them soon, then that should negate the advantage that the Russians have that. Now, whether they decide to escalate to something more than a basic chemical weapon, then I think everybody is paying a really, really close eye to. So part of their modus operandi has been very effective, along with a few other things they're doing. But really, as Roland has said in the military update, I understand from Colonel X and others that the front lines are not shifting a whole lot at the moment. We've talked about how spent the Russian army is, how difficult they're getting conscripts. And I know that Verity Bowman is doing a piece today talking about how some very ill Russians are now being put in the front line because they're really running out. No doubt she'll come on the pod at some stage to talk about that. But on the chemical weapons issue, hopefully now British gas masks are on their way out there or there. That should negate it. But it is a war crime. It's illegal under the Chemical Weapons Convention. It's illegal under the Geneva Conventions. And hopefully the UN's body, the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, will collect all this evidence and data, which the Ukrainians are collecting, and at some stage will issue arrest warrants, exactly as we did in Syria. We collected the evidence, and the German government then issued an arrest warrant for those responsible, President Assad and others. And hopefully at some stage they will have their day in court, because these weapons are absolutely abhorrent. And that's where we are on the chemical weapons issue.
Thank you very much, Hamish. We'll now move to political updates, and today I'm going to zoom in on frozen Russian assets, because Bloomberg reports that momentum is building in Europe and that Germany is shifting its stance and is now considering potentially using these assets to support Ukraine. So we've talked a lot about this in the podcast. You may remember that I had interviewed Sir Bill Browder and lawyer Julia Ziskina on this subject in March earlier this year. So just to recap a little bit what we're talking about here. We're talking about $300 billion in Russian central bank assets, about 2/3 of which are held by the Belgian clearinghouse called Euroclear. The big question has been, what can we do with these funds while they're mobilized, and how can we generate revenue from them? Now, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, a few days ago said that the EU needed to find new ways to make Russia pay for its war. And one of the options that she suggested is to explore the idea of providing Ukraine with a reparation loan that would be based on the interests generated from these assets. That would allow the EU to circumvent thorny legal questions, and one would expect the loan to be paid back by Russia itself when it does pay reparations to Ukraine for the war, which one would expect at some point in the years to come. Whether that is realistic, optimistic, or pragmatic, we'll have to see in due time. In the past, Germany has been cautious about this idea. But now it is a strong advocate for maximizing returns from these funds. So why have they changed their stance? Well, it's not really clear at this stage. The reason why Germany has shown cautiousness in the past is because were the US to pull out of supporting Ukraine financially, and were they to pull out of this mechanism around the frozen assets, then it would fall on Berlin to shoulder the majority of the financial burden. That is obviously a lot to take on for the biggest economy in the EU, and it would also play out in the domestic political scene in Germany because it would continue to fuel the rise of Germany's far right. Another option that is being looked at, and that is supported by the US and some European countries such as Poland, Czechia and the Baltic states generally, is to seize these assets outright. Western Europe, on the other hand, so countries like Germany, as we've just talked about, France and Belgium, have been a lot more cautious about this option because they fear a lot of legal and financial risks. So where does the UK stand? Well, it doesn't reject asset seizure outwardly like the rest of Western Europe. In fact, David Lammy, who was Foreign Secretary, supported seizing at least some of these assets and was a lot more in favour of that. So we'll have to watch out for the UK's position with the new Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, and as David Lammy has become Deputy Prime Minister. So what have we got to look forward to? The finance ministers of the EU will meet in Copenhagen this week and again at the end of October to discuss this. And a final decision is expected at the EU Leaders Summit at the end of October. I think that's around the 23rd, 24th of October. And I'll end on the analysis that Mark Champion wrote in Bloomberg on the subject. The concern remains that none of this emerges as part of a coherent, committed strategy to stop Putin in eastern Ukraine, but as something more of an ad hoc and therefore frail. Europe lacks critical resources and is subject to political constraints as centrist leaders who grasp the reality of the Russian threat are replaced by populists from the far right who don't, fantasizing instead about Putin as an ally in the only conflict they're truly concerned about, their own culture war with liberalism. These populists include not just Hungary's Viktor Orban or Robert Fico of Slovakia, but also leaders in the National Assembly in France, the UK's Reform Party, and Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. That's for the frozen assets. Also in the headlines today, the Ukraine and the UK have ratified yesterday the 100-year partnership signed in January by President Zelensky and PM Keir Starmer. Just a recap of what that includes: increased British military support for Ukraine, allocating at least 3.6 billion British pound per year until the year 2030-2031, training for Ukrainian soldiers and pilots, military aviation supplies, expanded defence industry cooperation, and involvement in joint formats like the UK-led Joint Expeditionary Forces. And finally, Ukraine has brought back 16 children from Russian-occupied territories in recent days. The story on the Kyiv Independent gives a broader overview of who these these children were and what their background is. I'll just focus on two of them. One of them was a 15-year-old boy whose parents and older brother were sentenced by Russian authorities to lengthy prison terms on fabricated charges. And another one of those is a 10-year-old boy who was nearly taken from his parents by Russia's child welfare services before being safely reunited with the rest of his family in Ukraine.
Last week, I spoke with Anastasia Dovbnia of Save Ukraine. She was in London for the launch of their joint report with War Child. We've featured interviews about this last week on the podcast. You'll find the link to the report in the show notes. Anastasiia gave us an overview of their efforts to bring children home and of the increased militarization of those who come back. Here's our conversation.
Anastasia, it's so good to see you again. Last time we spoke, we were in Kyiv at the beginning of August during my reporting trip. You've come all the way to the UK for this event at Tottenham Court Road. Why is it important that you're here and that this is taking place?
First of all, thank you for asking. And this campaign is great because it helps us amplify the message about Ukraine's stolen children who we are so much struggling to rescue. This campaign is being done with War Child, with whom we also conducted a report where we analyzed 200 testimonies of Ukraine's stolen children to find and to explicitly explain the issue of militarization of these kids. Right now, we are rescuing as much as we can, and during the August, we rescued 101 more Ukrainian stolen children, and among those children, a lot of those who've been either already going to military camps, being prepared to become soldiers, or who've been subjected to military education at schools. One boy, for example, 16 years old, he was just going to school, he was going through Russian educational curriculum, which actually, through all the testimonies that we see, has nothing to do with education. It's more like a military training. And one day, military guys from Russian side, they just came to school and started to make trainings to teach children how to tackle drones, how to manage weapons. And after that classes, they did a whole list that they passed to the director, and it was described who out of the class did the best during this class. And then the director just came to every single child, forcing them to go to a special military camp for 3 weeks to prepare for a battlefield. And first, they told that there would be much better conditions than just under occupation. Second, when they understood that nobody is actually agreeing to go there, they were threatening them with economic penalties. They needed to pay not to go to a military camp. And those kids who were forced finally to go, they did witness that they were forced to manage weapons, they were forced to control drones with a laser attacks, which were pointed at human beings during the trainings. And that's what simply shows us that Russia's attack on children is deliberate, it's systematic, and that's what we wanted to show through this campaign as well, that each of these child is a unique story that needs to be heard, and each of these child should be rescued.
How old are the children that you're talking about now that are being sent to militarization camps like that?
It's children of different age, for mostly children who are already in military camps from the age of 14 years old till 17 years old. When they turn 18, they are forced to go to Russian military following the draft notice that they most probably will be given at the age of 17. But what do we see? That Russians are incorporating elements of military education throughout all classes at school, and that is the most horrifying thing, because it's not only about elder kids, but it's more systematic when from the younger age, when the child is the most vulnerable, they're already trying to impose this narrative by inviting militaries to come to school to talk simply about their successes liberating Ukrainian territories. They're forced to praise them, they're forced to say that they're going good to liberate their homeland, and that one day Russia will be everywhere in Ukraine, and that's just a matter of time.
The 200 interviews with different children that provide the groundwork of the report were all conducted with children who have recently escaped, who've recently been brought back to Ukraine. What are some of the changes that you see and some of the evolutions from the earlier cases of returned children earlier on in the war?
So first of all, it's the level of trauma, because children who we are rescuing now, those are children who've been, for example, hidden within their yards on occupied territories for 3 years. Some of them were hidden inside of their houses. They were not allowed just to go and walk outside because their parents were afraid that militaries will just come and grab them under reason that would be absolutely made up. We just rescued a boy with his sister. They are 2 children who are now orphans because their mother was killed by Russians. And the day after their mother was buried, Russian authorities came to take these children to the orphanages. And we rescued them just before all the documents were done, just before these children were in Russian system. And we can only imagine what it would take to rescue them afterwards, because we see that evidence that it's the hardest thing to rescue kids when they're already in Russian state authorities' websites, being put up for adoption, etc., etc., because after that, they're all in Russian databases being considered as absolutely Russian children. And first of all, yes, it's a level of trauma that they bear because they have gone through something that no child should go through. When you hear the missiles attack nearby everywhere, when you know that neighboring house was hit and that somebody just came to rescue people who might have survived under the rubbles, and Russia did a second hit. They use this tactic very frequently, and that's something that gradually breaks the sense of safety of child, the sense of trust, and that's something that we are trying to re-establish during our rehabilitation programs after we are rescuing them.
The work of Save Ukraine is directly aimed at getting children back into Ukraine and making sure they come back. The number of children who manage to come back is extremely small. Can you give me a sense of scale of how many children come back every month, every week, and how much time it takes to get one child back?
It's absolutely unique because right now, as far as there is no official mechanism, no standard mechanism to return kids back, because Russia has never given any information and any safe path for them to be returned. That's why each rescue is a special operation that is being conducted. And it absolutely depends on where this child is, how long this child was under occupation, whether it was transferred to Russia, whether it's an unaccompanied minor, or it's a child who has parents on occupied territories, whether the parents have been captured, for example, and how much close they are to, for example, Ukrainian military or Ukrainian authorities. This and many more factors influence the fact how long the rescue mission will be conducted. It could be from 3 to 6 months. It could be 1 month, if that's sort of easier, but never easy case. That's why it absolutely differs. And above the estimates, unfortunately, right now, based on the information of 2023, when Russian Ombudswoman Maria Lvova-Belova told that they rescued so-called but officially registered Ukrainian children in Russia, after that we never heard any other number that will state how many more children were abducted since then. That's why, as for now, estimates total is that 1.6 million children are now both in Russia and on occupied territories, and we are highly encouraging the whole international community, governments of different states, to urge Russia to give the real estimate, give the real information about status, about the whereabouts of these children, because only after this, we'll know exactly how many of these children are orphans, how many of these children did have parents, but Russia killed those parents very often deliberately to then take children out of the family. Because usually, and we also have these stories when, for example, parents were killed and 3 children were living with their grandfather, Russian authorities were attending this house regularly, saying that the grandfather is not capable, probably, to take care of these children. That's why these children will now be Russian. And they talk about this openly, that they're threatening to take these children out of family. And that's what they're doing to both children on occupied territories and in Russia. And that's why we fully believe that all of these children needs to be talked about and needs to be rescued.
Can you tell me about the number of children who come back and what the scale of the returns is?
Yes, so right now, overall, with the help of all organizations involved, it's 1,300 children who've been returned, and more than 830, it's about the efforts of Save Ukraine. Last month, we've been able to rescue the largest number of kids, but as for now, all rescue operations are becoming much more harsh because Russia is intensifying define its safety conditions that they are imposing to create obstacles for these children to be rescued. That's why we are now extending our cooperation with different organizations, with international partners to be supported, and within our own capacity to find new ways to rescue these children, because seeing what is happening to these children, we clearly see that time is against us, because children are being more and more indoctrinated and less willing to be rescued. They less willing to change the circumstances they are living in. They even being under the constant threat, and they are less and less have access to information about simply an opportunities to be rescued, because Russia is deliberately closing all the channels for this information.
What sort of obstacles is Russia putting in your way when it comes to bringing the children back?
It's about access to information. It's about creating any kind of reasons why this child cannot go through the checkpoints. One of the simplest ones is that families do afraid to start their way to be rescued when their elder son, for example, got a draft notice, because they are simply afraid to cross the checkpoint, because when Russians will see this child in the database, their ones, they will see that this child is possibly will be prepared to serve in Russian army, and they can be interrogated and can be tortured. They will do any filtrations measures when they would be separated on a checkpoint and interrogated separately to not to allow these families to go.
You've talked about a standard return mechanism for the children. In an ideal world, what would that look like for you at Save Ukraine? And how can countries like the UK help you implement that?
Unfortunately, right now there is no an ideal mechanism, but some part of it which could be implemented is first that I probably mentioned about access to information, and given from Russia this access to information, because that is first an essential step to start at least any mechanism, because the creation of mechanism will definitely depend on the scale of the crime and the status of these children, of how many of them are already in Russian families, being adopted with their changed names and identities, how many of them are serving in military on the Russian side, how many of them are killed. That's the first step. Second step that need to be implemented is creation of a safe and accessible mechanism for these families even to express their desire to be rescued. Because right now, as Russia is blocking all the channels for communication, is imposing this huge and strong bubble of propaganda, families could not freely reach out to any organization to say that we want to come back to Ukraine-controlled territories. They cannot do that, or they just do not know any means how that could be implemented in a really safe way. And that's why could it be through the protective power mechanism or an alternative one that should be definitely a step 2, ensuring that without any economic penalties, as we saw that happened in history, and with absolutely free and safe way to express their desire, that should be implemented.
The UK has just announced a second package of sanctions against specific individuals and organizations involved in the indoctrination, the militarization of Ukrainian children. How do you respond to the news of that package, and do you think that's enough?
First of all, we are very grateful to Joanna Baxter and everybody involved to creation of this new package of sanctions, because bringing those perpetrators who've been involved in crimes against children and bringing to justice, bringing to accountability all those involved is one of integral parts of rehabilitation and reintegration of any victim. But of course, unless all the children would be rescued, unless we'll know where they are, in which conditions they are, that never would be enough. And that's why we are continuing to talk about these children. We are continuing to extend in our capacity and partners. We are continuing to collaborating to do as much as possible. But that's essentially one of the biggest steps that was done. And we really appreciate UK government to taking the leading role, not only about speaking about those children, but actually taking action.
Do the sanctions actually help you return the children home, finding new children and getting them home?
Right now, there is no direct connection to that, but we are working with different organizations to see how can we, through knowing the name of these people involved, trying to investigate and find new children.
Is there anything else you'd like to mention that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, I would say that to everybody who is listening to this podcast, to this material, we would really love to encourage you to go to our social media, to our website, and do two main things. First is to support in any possible way that you would love to, through donations, through suggestion to collaborate, through volunteering, the rescue missions and rehabilitation of these children, because that's one and the most simple and direct way to help. And second is please use anything that you will find of those media sources, like stories of these children or any data, to amplify the voice of these children still in Russian captivity. And please know that Save Ukraine is always open to provide you with any more possible information to make it the easiest way for you to speak for those who are now voiceless.
Anastasia, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
And now we'll move on to our final thoughts. Roland, do you want to start?
Yeah, it's just a thing I think we missed, actually, and I probably should have mentioned at the beginning. UK counter-terror police this morning say they arrested 2 men and a woman in southeast England on suspicion of spying for Russia. The police say all 3 were arrested on suspicion of assisting a foreign intelligence service contrary to Section 3 of the National Security Act. It's a 41-year-old man, a 35-year-old woman were arrested at the same address, and a 46-year-old man at a different address in the Grays area of southeastern Essex. Now, we don't know much more about the case, but I think it's interesting what Dominic Murphy, the head of Counter-Terrorism Command, said, which kind of tells us, I think, really what's going on here. We're seeing an increasing number of who we would describe as proxies being recruited by foreign intelligence services, and that would fit into the pattern I'm sure you've talked about on the podcast before, and we've definitely been writing about it ad nauseum. It seems like a very long time now. The Russian tactic of hiring freelancers via Telegram and social media and so on. So it sounds to me that these are, it doesn't tell us what nationality these people were, but it doesn't sound like they were actually Russians, but they may have been working as proxies for the Russian services. So that small bit of news I thought I should throw in there, and that's the extent of my final thoughts.
Thanks very much, Roland. Briefly, I'm just going to mention the event at the Honourable Artillery Company that Dom started advertising yesterday. Will be doing an in-person conversation and Q&A on the 22nd of October, starting at 7 p.m. in London. The panel will include General Sir Richard Barrons, former head of UK Joint Forces Command, and latterly one of the authors of Britain's Strategic Defence Review, and Orysia Lutsevich, head of the Ukraine Forum at the Chatham House think tank. The tickets are open to everybody, but there aren't that many, so if you want one, just snatch it while they're still there, and they can be purchased at telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine Live. Thank you very much. And Hamish, you're still here. Do you want to close the show with your final thoughts?
Yeah, thanks very much, Adélie. I just sort of going back to the defence conference, the DSCI last week, I spoke to so many military friends, British military friends and others who sort of restated how important to them Ukraine the Latest podcast actually is, and how many of you serving military people out there are listening now, or will certainly listen when it's in the podcast mode. And I was engaged with people at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst yesterday who were telling me that the Ukraine the Latest podcast is almost directed listening for all the young officer cadets at Sandhurst. So you guys are doing a great job, and I'm always very keen and happy to be part of that. My final thought, really looking to all our young men and women who are training at the moment. This is in the British Army. I'm sure it's the same in other NATO countries as well. Some fellow armchair generals, experts like me, you often hear them decrying of whether we are really learning the lessons that are being hard won by Ukrainian military personnel fighting the Russians. And I can say absolutely they are. And certainly in the British military, they are. They're not shouting about it, but they're definitely doing it. And there's a lot of, I think, unfair criticism of the British military. And the next piece I'll be writing in the next day or so will really be putting what I think is the real answer, that actually I think the British military at the moment is really going in the right direction. And the young men and women who are joining it are probably better than the young men and women I joined the army with 30 or 40 years ago. So I think people should be reassured about that. The military might be smaller and doesn't quite get the finance it used to, but actually still pound for pound, they are absolutely up to it. And those people who are working with the Ukrainians and learning from them are taking good notes. And as long as we keep supporting them, we will have the military force that we require.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nichols and Francis Durnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Durnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.